We are happy to welcome you back as we continue our assembly. We are now in for an incredible treat with our next speaker, our keynote speaker for this evening, Drew Hart. Drew Hart is a public theologian and religion professor at Messiah University, a nationally ranked private Christian university in Pennsylvania. In addition to teaching, he provides anti-racism and faith-based justice talks and workshops across the country and collaborates with local faith-rooted organizers, activists, and leaders in Harrisburg. His first book, Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism, was chosen as a 2016 Book of the Month by Inglewood Review of Books. In 2017, Dr. Hart was the recipient of the Brethren Community Ministries Peacemaker Award, and in 2019 was chosen as Elizabethtown College's Peace Fellow. His newest book, Who Will Be a Witness, Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance, calls the church to action, offering a way forward that is deeply rooted in the nonviolent liberation of Jesus Christ. It was my honor a year ago to meet Dr. Hart at Luther Seminary, to share a meal together, and to hear his extraordinary lecture. And now I am just thrilled to welcome you here with us as we gather for the Minneapolis Area Synod. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Bishop Ann. I really appreciate the honor to be invited here to share. And I know that this is particularly a heavy time right now as we as a nation have undergone so much. And so I know my heart has been heavy thinking about George Floyd, thinking about Daunte Wright, and having been in your region a couple times, building a relationship with Luther Seminary, it has been on my mind, particularly heavy. So leading up to this moment, I wasn't sure what exactly I had to say, right? Just thinking about the weight of all that has been going on. But I guess what I want us to start off thinking about is just the need to tell a more truthful story and how that might reorient us in the work that we do, how we can tell a more truthful story as it relates to white supremacy, society, and the church. Years ago, when I first moved back to central Pennsylvania, I was invited to speak at the college that's kind of connected to Messiah University. The church that's connected there. And when I came to speak, it's a large church, some professors and, well-to-do church there. And they were doing a series on racism. And so they asked me to kind of close out the final Sunday to do a workshop and Sunday school class and then preach. And so I did that and had a great time and engaged the congregation and really was received well. And one of the things I told them about was the civil rights bus tour that my friend leads. And so they decided in response to that to send some people on the civil rights bus tour. And so a year later, at the exact same time that I had spoken, they brought my friend Todd Allen to speak to them and to also give another talk at that same time. And as you can imagine, like a church that had sent people on a civil rights bus tour, they were showing pictures and music, and it was kind of like this kind of reflective memorial of like all that the people had experienced and kind of sharing that with the rest of the congregation. And right as the kind of picture montage ended and my friend was right about to get up and speak, older white gentleman stood up in the middle of the congregation and yelled out, "Why can't we just get over it? Why can't we just get over it?" Of course, that's not the exact thing that you want yelled out into the congregation right before you're about to, preach. And so, he jokes about it now, but I always wonder, what would I have said if I were the one who someone had yelled that out right before I was about to speak? Why can't we just get over it? And I often think of myself as having a little bit of a troubled mind, good trouble, right? Holy trouble. But my mind wanders and wants to think about like what I would do in certain situations. And so I thought about the fact that maybe what I might want to have done in that situation is to make that a learning moment. To lean into the moment rather than to try to avoid that moment. And so I might want to ask him some questions so that I don't assume anything about this gentleman. So I might want to ask him about his life and his journey and his community that led him to think that the reality of what we needed now was to get over this thing called racial justice and anti-racism. And so I might ask him about his personal life. Maybe for all I know, he, as an individual has lived his whole entire life committed to racial justice, right? Maybe he had decades and decades of just working for racial justice. He had been committed to that work. And so finally, as his life was coming to a close, he felt like the work was done and there was nothing else to do. And so he felt like it was time to get over it. It's time to move on to the next challenge. Maybe it's possible that he came from a long line of folks, right? I might want to ask him about his intergenerational lineage, and maybe his great-great-grandfather, struggled, maybe he was an abolitionist in his family line, right? And maybe his dad worked with Dr. King, and maybe he might have had this long legacy of anti-racism work and racial justice work in his lineage. And so he felt that, he's seen this line of faithfulness. And so now suddenly, after all this generations of faithfulness, it was time to get over it. Maybe his community, everybody around him had always been committed to struggling against white supremacy and doing their anti-racism work. And so that was just something he saw all around him all the time. And again, after the work had been done, he felt like there was nothing else to do. And so it was time to get over it. Now, I'll be honest, like I've never met anybody that fits that category. Right? I've never known anybody who their entire life has been committed to anti-racism, racial justice, where their whole lineage, everyone from before them up to their present, has been at work doing intergenerational struggling against this, and where everybody in their whole entire community that they're a part of has been working against it. In fact, the reality is that for most white Christians, it's almost the exact opposite, right? That for most white Christians, they haven't been doing that work at all. There certainly is no intergenerational continuity of anti-racism and racial justice thread. And there certainly aren't, for most white Christians, communities in which everyone around them has been doing that work. It's a very rare thing. In fact, probably the folks that are most likely to have been doing that kind of work would actually be the ones to say that there's so much more work to be done. So if the case is that the odds are that he has not lived his entire life doing anti-racism work, he has not had this intergenerational work struggling, and he has not been a community that's been immersed and committed to this, then maybe we might want to ask a different kind of question to start us off today. The question might not be, when can we get over it? But the real question might be, can we get on it for the first time? Right? Can we get on it for the first time? And so that's really what I want us to launch us into, is to think about what does it mean for us to really get serious about struggling against white supremacy, about anti-racism work, about building and struggling for racial justice in our society today, that we can do this work, but we need to really get on it seriously for the first time in ways that we have never done before. And so we need to grapple with white supremacy and the ways that it shapes our society and the church. One of the things that I've become acutely aware of as we begin to think through these things and these conversations are growing all around the nation is that in the church, there's a lot of naivete around the relationship between white supremacy and the church. In fact, even folks who often have something meaningful to say, sometimes we understate the actual history and reality of the role that the church played in racism, right? And so it's very common today that you'll hear folks talk about the church and the ways that it has been complicit in racism. And it's true, the church has certainly been complicit in racism, but in many ways, that's actually not really telling the full truth. What I want to argue and contend is that the church was not just complicit in racism, but that the church literally birthed white supremacy and modern racism as we know it into the world. Consider this. In 1441, Portugal began enslaving Africans, right? And that's the beginning of Western Christianity getting involved in the African slave trade. 1455, we have Pope Nicholas V, who issues Romanus Pontifex. And basically that papal bull was giving permission for the Christian West to plunder and to enslave, right? It's actually a very horrifying text if you ever have the chance to read it. 1492, we have Christopher Columbus. That's usually where people begin the story, who arrives at an already inhabited island of the Bahamas. And from there forward, we have this history of conquest and plunder, the perpetual enslavement of Black people, stolen resources, and the overall pursuit of social domination and control over others, which all of it is being justified theologically and biblically by mainstream Western Christianity, both Protestants and Catholic. And what we see from that history is that as in the West, as Christendom grew and expanded, and this kind of form of Christian supremacist, coercive Christianity from the top down, where the church and the state were married together, that in the late medieval period, you have all of a sudden this practice of Christian supremacist practice over society being birthed and mutated into white supremacy. And so in light of that history, today we've inherited a mangled Christianity, a diseased Christianity, a deformed Christianity that still is implicated and oftentimes we have not done the deep we've not done the critical work, the deep pulling at the roots of the things that had gave birth to white supremacy to begin with. And so we've got so much more to understand. Years ago, I was invited by a pastor to meet with him while I was still, way back when I was still an MDiv student. And we met, I was in Philly, and we met in the suburbs of Philly, kind of halfway between where he lived and me coming out of Philly. And there we were, we met at a McDonald's. And it was like a summer afternoon, really hot summer afternoon. And we went and we just got like sweet tea cups, right? And there we were, and we're kind of sharing our stories, and we had our sweet tea cups. And I always joke that I love sweet tea. I love like the real like sugary sweet tea where like, you know, it's so sugary, the straw sticks in and it doesn't move, right? Because it's just too much sugar where you're drinking it and like you feel the sugar going into your teeth, and your dentist like wakes up with a hat, sweating, knowing that you've done something terribly wrong. That's the kind of good old fashioned sweet tea. And McDonald's, it's not real sweet tea, but it's good enough for our moment. So we were enjoying it and staying cool and just swapping stories and getting to know each other some. And as we were talking, my friend, he grabs the sweet tea cup that's between us, and he says, "Drew, you see this cup? I can't see what's on your side of the cup, and you can't see what's on my side of the cup, and I need your eyes to see what's on your side of the cup, and you need my eyes to see what's on my side of the cup," right? And I was like, oh, this is really kind, right? I was at first not sure where he was going, but I was like, okay, I see where he's going with all this. And so he finished up talking, and I said, that's really nice and all, but the fact of the matter is, I already know what's on your side of the cup. Now, of course, I'm sure he probably thought like, Drew is kind of arrogant. Who says that, right? But then I explained to him what exactly I meant. I said, look, from very early on, even when I lived in a majority Black neighborhood, when I went to school, I had majority white teachers. I was introduced to majority white history, literature, art. At every stage in my education, in fact, I had majority white teachers, right? When I went off to college at a Christian college, I was the only African-American on my floor. I had to learn how to navigate that space, right? Even in terms of now, I mean, in the classroom, it's usually majority white when I teach at the college level, when I go and speak. Often I have to know what white people are thinking and how they're interpreting my body. And so for me, I've always had to navigate white cultural space. But what I explained to him was that he doesn't have to do the opposite. That doesn't have to reciprocate, right? And so he actually was like an IVP author and was, at a kind of growing missional church, young 20s, 30s some. And I said to him, like you can go your whole entire life, never step foot in a Black community, and it's not going to harm your well-being. In fact, no one expects you to understand Black theology, Black intellectual thought, Black history, right? Black trends and all these different things that are going on in society. And so it's not reciprocated. And so the reality is that what I wanted him to understand was that as nice as it was that we were having that conversation, us having a conversation over sweet tea is not going to end the realities of white supremacy, because what we're talking about are institutions and policies and practices and systems and all these realities that create unlevel grounds, right? An uneven playing field that we all have to navigate. And so if we're going to begin to deal with the realities of white supremacy in our society today, we're going to have to go beyond superficial answers, right? Sometimes in the church, we're known for offering simplistic answers to complex problems. And so after centuries of white supremacy, we think that the best answer is let's just do a pulpit swap, right? Or a potluck together. Those things are good. I'm not saying don't do those things, but those things will not solve these bigger social problems that we're dealing with. These are much huger problems that we've got to confront. So we've got to understand the nature of white supremacy in our society today, and we've got to understand our own participation in these realities. I remember years ago, I don't know if you guys remember when Paula Deen had made big news, right? Paula Deen had been in the news, and she had wanted a like plantation style wedding. She got caught because she had used the N-word. It was a whole mess. It was a whole range of stuff that she had done. And then she, after everyone, like it was all over the news, and then she gave like this really awkward fake celebrity apology. And what I remember about that time was that everyone, it didn't matter, like across the spectrum, like everybody was kind of like shaming Paula Deen, like conservative, progressive, everybody, like everyone across all kinds of the whole political spectrum, right? Everyone was like, bad Paula Deen, shame on you, how racist, how terrible, how could you say such things, right? And I remember really upset with the things that she had said and did. And so I I was jumping in, like bad Paula Deen, shame on you, bad, bad, bad. And then all of a sudden I paused. I was like, something just doesn't seem right about what's going on here. How is it that everybody is wagging their finger at Paula Deen? How is it that everybody is putting all the blame on Paula Deen? So I had to think about it. I had to ask myself a question. Did Paula Deen like create racism? Like, was she the origination of all of this? Was she like a mad scientist that, went into her lab and like created, the formula and then spread it into our water? Like, is she, why did we imagine that she's somehow responsible for the problem of racism, right? And so the reality is that what everyone was doing was scapegoating Paula Deen. But something happens when we easily scapegoat the bad racists and then keep our hands clean. It gives us a false perception of our own participation or lack of participation in the society that we live in. And so for me, I had to think about it. I was like, well, let's see, like if I want to understand how and in which ways Paula Deen came up with these ideas, all I would have to do is open up a history book, right? At least an honest one. And you can see exactly where Paula Deen came up with this stuff, right? In fact, you read American history, honestly, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Exactly why and how someone like Paula Deen might say the things that she did. In fact, if we're honest about it, once we acknowledge that it's a part of our history, the inertia of centuries of work going on, then we can't scapegoat Paula Deen, because Paula Deen was socialized and was a participant in communities and in society and in institutions, right? And so the question is, she didn't create this, she was taught this, she had caught this, and then she perpetuated it. She is certainly responsible for her perpetuation of it, but the broader society is not, its hands are not clean. And I think that it's really important for us to not scapegoat the bad racists and then imagine ourselves as having clean hands, when in fact we've all got to acknowledge that, I mean, as basic Christian teaching, right, that we've all sinned, right, that we've all fallen short, that we all stand in need of God's grace. And if we can say that, then we also must acknowledge that we all are responsible and participants in society, and accountable then and responsible for what goes on in our society. And to what degree are we actively resisting racism? To what degree have we been complicit in it? Have there been times when we have perpetuated it, right? These are deeper questions that force us to do some self-examination work and to see that we all play a role, that the mere fact that we are part of our society means that we are participants in a racist society and cannot just scapegoat one individual and scapegoat the bad racists. I imagine that it would be easy, even right now, as everyone was upset with Derek Chauvin, to imagine he's just the bad person and everybody else is the good people, and not take account to the ways that we also can be silent and complicit in the way that our society is organized, in ways that it advantages whiteness, right, and harms and targets and discriminates and marginalizes and oppresses Black and other people of color all around our country. I believe that if we are going to take seriously the history and the inertia of white supremacy that shapes the church today, that some of what we will have to do is take seriously a renewal, a transfiguration, might I say, of Christian discipleship. That Christian discipleship must become explicitly and intentionally anti-racist and decolonizing. Christian discipleship must become explicitly and intentionally anti-racist and decolonizing. And if we're not doing that work in our own lives, in our communities, in our teaching, in our liturgy, and all that we do, that we will continue to perpetuate. But we want to be able to produce the kind of people that are capable of resisting in our society. I know most kids at some points, hopefully everybody at some point in your life has run up an escalator or gone up the escalator the wrong way, right? If you haven't done that, make sure you cross that off your bucket list. Everyone should at least do that at least one time before your life is over. At least once, you go up the escalator the wrong way. And what is interesting about going up an escalator is that it actually takes a lot of effort and work to go up the escalator the wrong way. You can't do it casually. It's not going to work. You'll probably still be, even as you're moving forward, at least trying to, you'll probably still be going backward. To go up, you have to do it with, you have to be deliberate, and you have to be intentional, and you have to kind of go at it and put some effort into it, because the force, the movement is already happening, right? Standing still, you're going to be moving. Moving just a little bit, it's not really going to do much. It's going to take deliberateness to actually get up from one floor and move up to the other floor. And I think that that's the same way that anti-racism work, struggling for racial justice, right? That it takes deliberateness. If we're going to seek and pursue, strive after the beloved community, that's a radical act that must take intentionality and means the undoing of the way that we've done things and pursuing a whole new life. And it's the same kind of effort, fighting against the inertia, centuries of white supremacy, centuries of anti-Black racism, centuries, right, of settler colonialism that we've got to resist and struggle through if we're going to make a difference. And so we want to get to that new floor, right? To the seeking and striving after beloved community, but it's going to take that kind of effort. It's a paradigm shift, and Christian discipleship is that site upon which we explicitly and intentionally must become anti-racist and decolonizing. I believe that there's work, transformation that must happen within the church, and then also externally as we go out and seek to make transformation in the broader society as well. Internally, the transformation that must go on is that we've got to realize the ways in which whiteness shapes life within communities. There's actually been really interesting work about white churches and even multiracial churches often, that what they find is that many churches that are, they prioritize white comforts over Black well-being. Even multiracial churches sometimes will prioritize white comforts over Black well-being, and that Black people are expected to assimilate into those contexts, to contort themselves, to readjust and conform to the already existing pattern. And so people want diversity, but they're not willing to undergo a radical revolution within their own lives, to reimagine what life can be when the first are last and the last are first. And so we've got to do a real transformation within the life of the church. I remember when I was fresh out of college, so this was a long time ago, and I gave a sermon, and I used an analogy. I had used an analogy of passing the remote control over, because it was something that my professor had said once. And so I talked about how, how people can have the remote for long enough, but after a while you've got to hand it over, so that there can be some new people kind of setting the agenda, basically, right? And so I talked about that in church because I was, at that time, I spent the first 3.5 years after I had graduated at a multiracial church. And what I had seen in that space was that although it was a multiracial church and they had hired me as a youth pastor there and had one other Black pastor out of the 5 pastors there, that all the church board was white, all the leadership positions were white, and the kind of overall culture that they were creating there was white dominant cultural as the norm. And then they would kind of have like other things sprinkled in, gospel choir and different things like that sprinkled in. But the norm and the defaults was white dominant culture. And so I use this remote control analogy, and afterwards, a lot of people were really upset. And I remember the pastor bringing us together to talk about what happened. And the pastor himself said that he thought it was actually a really good sermon overall, but he didn't like the remote control analogy. And of course, I was like really young at that time, so I didn't like say anything at all. I just kind of swallowed it because I felt like I was getting into some trouble. But I thought about it afterwards, about the fact that that particular sermon, that the thing that people didn't want to talk about at all was power. And I think there's a kind of naive way in which we think that power dynamics are not happening within the life of the church, and so they don't need to be addressed. It's a problem out there, not a problem within our own communities. But power is alive. There's all kinds of power at work in the life of communities. There's the formal power, right? Sometimes we just think of like clergy or whatever, but there's informal power as well. And there's hidden power and visible power, right, at work. And sometimes it's folks who give a lot of money or have the right last name or all kinds of different things at work. We've got to be able to have honest conversations about how power works, because racism is also about power and how that power is distributed and how it's concentrated and how it's abused and how it impacts those that are the least last and lost, right? The disinherited of the world, those who have their backs against the wall. And so we've got to be able to have healthy conversations about power in ways that actually subvert the norms of how power gets used in the rest of the world. When I have guests over my house, I often tell them to make themselves at home, right? So come make yourself at home. And you know, when I say make yourself at home, I'm inviting them to come in to, you know, kick their shoes off, to put their feet up. They're welcome to go into the fridge, grab a drink. You know, I just want them to be comfortable. I don't like when people come to my house and they're like all tight and stiff. Like I want people to be relaxed and to feel comfortable in my home. And so I say, make yourself at home. But if I'm honest, like when I say make yourself at home, I don't actually mean make yourself at home, right? Like I wish I did, like God is still working on me, because you want to get past the host and the guest kind of mentality, but I'm not quite there yet. And so like if someone were to come into my house and they were to like, you know, start rearranging furniture because they thought I meant make yourself at home, like that would not be okay with me. If they came into my house and like they started like taking down my family pictures and putting up their own, you know, that would not be okay with me. In fact, if they came into my house and they like, you know, I see them walking around, they had gone into my closet, they got my robe on and, you know, just a little too comfortable, like that's not what I meant when I said make yourself at home. And so at the end of the day, like I didn't really mean make yourself at home. They're still ultimately a guest in my space, and I'm just kind of allowing them certain privileges, right, in the midst of it. And so there's limits to what I actually mean, right, in terms of make yourself at home. They're not really home in that case. But then I could push this analogy a little bit farther, right? So I'm married. I got 3 boys, so I have 3 sons. And our family, you know, I guess we're a growing family. And you know, in our home, like Renee, that's my wife, she'll say sometimes, like we feel constrained sometimes in our house, like, because we've only got like one bathroom and it's like 5 of us, right, in the house. And so like maybe we could put like a extra like half bath like in this one spot over here. Maybe we could, do some structural changes to put another bathroom in the house, right? In fact, she's even at times talked about like maybe we could like knock out this wall, right? And have a more open space on the first floor. Like what would it do, to open that space up? And so I think that what she's talking about often is thinking about what does it mean for our family to restructure the house itself so that everybody has full belonging and can thrive and flourish in this space together, right? And I think that is a whole deeper level than just the kind of ornamental changes that we were initially talking about. That when we're talking about making these structural changes, these are things that, of course, are perfectly reasonable for my wife to be asking because she has full belonging in the house, right? And my kids have full belonging, and everyone needs to thrive. And if the way that it's structured currently is not working, that we need to radically restructure at times to make sure that everyone can thrive and flourish in our home. And I think that that's the same kind of mentality that the church must have as it organizes its life together. There's ways in which we've got to address the white supremacy ornamentally, like things like white Jesus, right? That still are in our sanctuaries. And we don't recognize that what we're talking about is that over time, Jesus was westernized and then whitened and made into a puppet for the status quo, right? Like misrepresenting the first century Palestinian Jew, right? And so that those ornamental things matter because it misrepresents the Jesus that didn't crucify, but that was crucified. So how do we address and make changes as necessary to better reflect who all is in the community? But then what does it mean to look at our policies and our practices, our structures, our institutions, and to make radical change if necessary, so that we really make sure that people have true belonging in the house of God? When imagine if the other thing that I want us to really think about as we're thinking about this kind of internal way of life is to think about the ways that, well, the church, we've got to do some like soul searching, some deep self-examination work. The church, like, we haven't been drugged into this problem. We dragged and created this problem and drugged the rest of the society into it. In fact, Robert Jones actually suggests in his research, it shows that to be white and Christian suggests that there's a higher likelihood of someone holding racist views on things like police brutality, on acknowledging the history and present realities of racist discrimination and obstacles, of views on immigrants and all kinds of stuff, right? Not just white evangelicals, but also white Protestants and white Catholics. That it's actually better. The stats were better for non-affiliated, non-religiously affiliated whites than for white Christians. Something has gone wrong in many communities where white Christian churches have actually been the hub that is actually helping to produce white supremacy rather than to transform and challenge it. And so we've got to see communities that confess and lament these realities and then are committed to repent and repair. They've got to confess and lament. They've got to repent and repair. And then when we deal with our in-house and have integrity in the way that we live our lives, then we're also ready to then also have a faithful witness, a faithful public witness, and a prophetic witness in society as well. Now, there's a famous saying that people say, give a man a fish, right, and he'll eat for a day. Teach a man a fish, right, he'll eat for a lifetime. But what people don't often ask is what happens to the people when the pond, when they don't have access to the pond, when it's been walled off, right? Then all of a sudden you've got deeper structural issues in play. because you've got to deal with this wall that's been built that's blocking access for people to get to the pond to fish in the first place. We've got to deal with the structural realities, the policies and practices, the institutions that help to create the conditions of inequality and inequity, of advantage and disadvantage in our society today. Some of that is going to require that we dream dangerous dreams, right? That we dream God's dream with God. Too often in the church, we've had too many status quo imaginations, right? Imagining that things can't be much different than the way things are, that all we can do is tweak just a little bit, rather than having more dangerous, broad dreams of God's new society, of God's reign, of what God desires to do, that we can actually dream and have a vision that undermines the world as it is, because we're committed to God's new society. And when we begin to do that, then we can actually go out and actually struggle for justice in meaningful ways at the grassroots level, from below, on the ground, in our communities, right? What's the ground game? What's it going to look like for us to actually seek change in our communities? And I believe that there's some things that are really conducive for the life of the church in their neighborhood, ways to bear faithful witness to the nonviolent Messiah. And these are three things. One is nonviolent action resistance. Second, it is protest movements, and then third, community organizing. I believe that these are three things that we've got to take seriously in terms of our local witness as we struggle for racial justice in our communities. Nonviolent action and resistance, I believe, is something that the church should be teaching and training and equipping people to participate in. There's a strong basis for nonviolent action and resistance, right? It's rooted in our conviction that every person is made in the image of God. It's rooted in the fact that we're called to love our enemies. And it's rooted in our conviction that our discipleship requires that we take up our cross in the way of Jesus, right? Not take up the cross in the kind of Western way that we talk about it, where we kind of water down the meaning and kind of adjust it to, like, sometimes, people like, they didn't get their parking spot at the mall and that's their cross to bear for Jesus. And, someone gave them a funny look, it's their cross to bear for Jesus. And, their electric blanket broke at night, but they're willing to take up the cross for Jesus. So that's not what it was meant, right? That Jesus actually meant, in the first century, it meant state-sanctioned execution. And when Jesus says, take up your cross, he's saying, are you willing to clash with evil, even to the point of accepting the consequences that come with that, right? And that's the kind of witness that we're invited to have as followers of Jesus, that we're actually clashing with the establishment, just like Jesus did when he came into Jerusalem, clash and bear witness and have a prophetic word and accept the consequences that come with our faithful witness in the public square. And so we have this nonviolent action that we can engage in. And despite, sometimes the dismissal of nonviolence, what we're actually seeing from social science is that nonviolence is actually extremely effective. In fact, they say that nonviolence, when it's creative and strategic and active and sustains, it's actually more effective, in fact, twice as successful as violence campaigns are, right? But the reason I think that sometimes it has this negative connotation is because we have this kind of romanticized, limited understanding of what we mean when we say nonviolence. And so usually when people say nonviolence, they really just mean, let's go have a march or a rally, right? And so we have this like one-hit wonder kind of approach to nonviolent resistance. But we think about like Gene Sharp's work. He had 198 tactics, right? In his book, The Nonviolent Action. That was in 1973, he came up with that. And even now, there's even more than that. There's lots of different ways to engage. And so it actually takes creativity, strategy. It must be active and sustained in the work that we do. Social science says that when nonviolent campaigns are at work, that only 3.5% of the population needs to be engaged in sustained and active work for it to be successful. It's always successful. And so it's actually a fascinating statistic. Nonviolent resistance is actually growing in effectiveness, while violent resistance is decreasing in effectiveness over the years. And then we have protest movements, right? It's really about mobilizing the masses. It's about broad participation. It's about creating a change in the social climate, It's about and shifting public opinion. It's about knocking down the pillars of support that upholds certain powers. It's about disruption and confrontation. And some of the strengths are that protest movements often can foster and ride cultural momentum, right? Participation is easy and accessible for masses of people. And of course, on the other hand, some of the weaknesses is that with little commitment and limited structure, protest movements often are short-lived, right? They don't last forever. They have their little bit of life and then they kind of die off. But what people have seen, and we've even seen that in recent years, is that even when they're short-lived, some protest movements can actually usher in significant change in even short amounts of time. And so we shouldn't dismiss them. But I do want us to turn our attention to community organizing, because I believe that that's really conducive for the life of the church in terms of the ways that we can be connecting and partnering in solidarity with our neighbors to bring change. And it's really about, again, organization, right? Its strategy is about building a committed power base of ordinary people through formal structures to leverage in pursuit of incremental social change over the long haul, right? How do we build a power base of people and use that to identify challenges and confront them one after the other, identifying the needs that the people have identified themselves and working collectively together to bring change. And its strength is precisely that it is a committed membership that's doing the work regardless of what is popular in society or not. Community organizing doesn't need the momentum of what's mainstream at any given moment. It's focused on tangible goals at the grassroots level and working for change and building its power base from that. And so organizing really helps ordinary people realize that they have agency, that folks that might otherwise feel like there's nothing that can be done actually do have a voice, especially when we have our collective power together. They accomplish local goals and again, grow capacity over the long haul. And I really appreciated hearing a little bit about some of the efforts going on in Minneapolis around reparations as well. Without saying too much on the topic, I always wonder how Christians can read and wrestle with, the story of Zacchaeus, right? And not walk away and think, reparations are necessary and that's a part of God's Jubilee good news for society, right? And now I do understand why, because so many churches have, we teach from a very early age the Zacchaeus song, right? Zacchaeus was a wee little man. And so we sing this song about him in the sycamore tree and all of that. But then at the end of the song, it takes out the punchline of what the story is all about, which is that Zacchaeus has a come to Jesus moment. And in that moment, declares that he's going to give half of his wealth to the poor and then do reparations 4 times what he has exploited as a tax collector. He's going to give back to them, right? And so we have this really beautiful example of reparations there as well. And this is the kind of repair work that the church ought to be seeking as well. So when we think about all of these realities, we've got to really get serious as the church, both internally and externally, to be the change, to be the good news, to live that out, to make visible God's reign, right? So that literally the Jesus story is being told in our lives. It's visible for other people to see the Jesus story being told because we're living it out on the ground on behalf of our neighbors, so that the first are last and the last are first, that those on the edges, margins, and cracks of society, that the kingdom, the reign of God is bursting out and participating and growing in our society all around us. I want to end with this story that hopefully can encourage us to really get to work, right? If we started off by saying that the challenge has not been how do we get over it, but how do we begin it for the first time, right? How do we really get serious about racial justice? How do we really get serious about the anti-racism work? How do we really get serious about seeking shalom and the thriving and flourishing of all people all throughout our society and all around the world? If we're going to be about that, then we've got to be the church that has a real presence in our society. So in 1963, Dr. King was working on the Birmingham campaign. And while they were there, they were getting a bit frustrated because things were not working out the way that they thought it ought to. And so people were not showing up to get arrested as much as they had hoped. They were running out of bail funds. There was this injunction that was put up against them, so coming up, they couldn't march. And they just weren't sure what to do. And then for them at that moment, they were actually at this particular moment, right about to approach Easter and Passover weekend. And so there, Dr. King and a bunch of his, friends and leaders in the movements that were gathered there, they all were in a hotel room, sitting around, discussing and trying to dialogue around what needs to happen next. How should they respond? And so they're arguing and they're discussing, thinking about all the different options. And some of them were saying, look, we got to just keep going forward. We've got to just, push forward. And
a few weeks later, that I basically turned around and I was still doing journalism as contract work that I.
Okay. Sorry. So some of what was happening was that there they are and they're not sure what to do next. And so some people were saying, we've got to just push forward and go against the injunction. Others were saying, look, we've got to raise funds. Why don't we send Dr. King out? He can raise funds like nobody else can. So we'll put it on pause and he can raise funds and then we'll start back up again. Others were saying, look, most of us, we're pastors. We can't not be around for Easter Sunday. So we've got to go back to our home churches. It's the biggest day of the Christian calendar, right? We've got to be in our churches. And so they're just arguing about what they need to do. And nobody has any agreement about what needs to be done. And the whole time, Dr. King is just sitting there. He's not saying anything at all. He's just listening quietly. And as he's listening quietly and they're arguing, he gets up. And if you can imagine, it's like the kind of hotel room where there's a door and like a bedroom, and then there's like an open area. He goes and leaves and goes into the bedroom and closes the door and leaves everyone out in the living room space. And so they're just sitting there and Dr. King left. And then all of a sudden, like minutes later, the door swings open. Now, if you can imagine, like often when Dr. King, if you see like pictures of him, he's usually like in a black suit, black tie, white shirt, kind of like clean look. Well, Dr. King, when he opens the door, the first thing they notice is that he's changed his clothes. And so they see him and he's wearing now a blue jeans and a blue work shirt. And the moment that they see Dr. King in a blue jeans and a blue work shirt, everybody knows exactly what that means. When they see him in those blue jeans, they know that for Dr. King, this means it's time to get to work. When they see him in that blue work shirt, it means that it's time to roll up our sleeves and get to work. And that what they're going to be doing this Passover and Good Friday and Easter weekend is they're not going to just be going into church to celebrate the good news. They're going to embody it, right? They're going to practice it. They're going to live it out. And so that's exactly what they did. In fact, there's a famous picture now of Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy and who else? Fred Shuttlesworth, right? Those three together, and they're marching and leading it. Then Dr. King gets arrested and he's put in jail. In fact, that's where he writes his famous letter from Birmingham jail. And I think that what's powerful about this story for us is that it's an invitation for all of us, right? It's an invitation for all of us to say, it's time for us to put on our blue jeans. As followers of Jesus, committed to seeking God's reign, as followers of Jesus that are praying that God's justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like ever-flowing streams, that it's time for us to participate in what God is doing, and that it's time for us to put on our blue jeans. And so my invitation for all of you is, let's put on our blue jeans. Let's put on our blue jeans for justice. Let's put on our blue jeans for truth. Let's put on our blue jeans for righteousness. Let's put on our blue jeans because too many Black people have been slaughtered by police in these streets. Let's put on our blue jeans because the school to prison pipeline is destroying our young people's lives. Let's put on our blue jeans and struggle for our undocumented neighbors. Let's put on our blue jeans and struggle to end the mass incarceration of over 2 million people in our nation. Let's put on our blue jeans for all those that have had their backs against the wall, the disinherited, those who've had foots on their neck. Let's put on our jeans and struggle in solidarity with our neighbors, with those who are most vulnerable, believing that God is at work, that God is with us, that he accompanies us, and empowers us and inspires us in our journey and gives us these dangerous dreams of God's dream for all people, for all creation, for all God's children. And so that's my invitation. Let's put on our blue jeans together. Let's struggle to be the church. Let's live into our calling as the church, standing and keeping attentive to those who are most vulnerable, those who've been harmed so much for centuries in our society, struggling for racial justice. God bless.
Wow, what a gift to, and I don't even know if you can hear me, Drew, but we are so grateful, not just for your witness tonight, which was so powerful, but your witness in your books, in your writings, in being a professor. I think all of us sat here thinking, oh, I'd love to sit in his class 3 days a week. And so just thank you for being such a powerful leader and witness in the work that the church needs to be doing as we follow Jesus, and that incorporates our work in racial justice in powerful ways. So look forward to reading your latest book.